A causal model is only as strong as its structural bedrock, but sometimes a foundational variable will fracture under the weight of an invisible assumption. To make sense of a complex world, comparative social science relies on classification. We take continuous, chaotic human history and compress it into tractable categories, sorting states into democracies, autocracies, or centralized systems. Over a century ago, Max Weber introduced the ideal type as a deliberately one-sided measuring rod. It was a conceptual tool designed to organize thought and frame comparisons, not a description of a naturally occurring object found in the real world. A quiet methodological hazard arises when researchers take these descriptive heuristics, code them into data sets, and promote them into explanatory primitives. They begin treating these categories as foundational, right-hand side variables in causal regression models. An ideal type and an explanatory primitive are distinct objects. A heuristic just needs to be illuminating. An explanatory primitive must be stable. Mistaking a heuristic for a primitive guarantees that the resulting statistical conclusions will be fragile and heavily contingent on how the categories were measured in the first place. We can evaluate this stability using the primitive stability framework. It acts as a gatekeeper, requiring any historical category to pass 3 specific tests before it is admitted into a causal model. The first test is recoverability. The proposed categories must organically emerge from raw underlying attributes, like the presence of taxation systems or lineage structures. They cannot be imposed onto the data from the top down. The second test is invariance. A category's assignment must stay put when researchers make reasonable adjustments to their spatial measurement rules. Small changes to how a border is drawn should not reshuffle a location into an entirely different institutional type. The third test is substantive stability. Even if a category survives spatial adjustments, the resulting causal narrative, the actual sign and direction of the historical effect, must survive changes to the temporal snapshot used by the coder. If a historical category fails these 3 tests, it is not an explanatory primitive. We are no longer measuring the history of the world, we are measuring the artifacts of our own algorithms. Consider a prominent effort to classify the precolonial states of sub-Saharan Africa. This typology divides the continent into 4 distinct institutional forms: federation, gatekeeper, regal, and despotic. This maps the political landscape of the 19th century, a vast continent defined by overlapping institutions, moving borders, and highly diverse forms of political organization. To analyze this landscape statistically, modern researchers translate the historical geography into a vast GIS dataset, slicing the continent into exactly 91,690 individual grid cells. We apply the recoverability test by looking at the foundational historical data that supposedly generates these 4 categories, attributes like lineage structure or whether a ruling council existed. Institutional data exists for only 23% of the mapped grid cells, yet the final map assigns a state category to nearly 100% of the surface. As a matter of basic mathematics, a category cannot be more complete than its own inputs. The categories did not inductively emerge from the data. A theoretical ordering was imposed on a void. Because precolonial authority rarely stopped at fixed borders, researchers model political power as radiating outward from core centers, decaying in strength over physical space. This introduces the invariance test. The spatial projection algorithm calculates decay by assuming that precolonial authority was constrained by pedestrian walking speed over the terrain. The baseline model maps territorial reach by calculating an 8-hour walk from a center. Shifting to a defensible 10-hour radius pushes projected borders outward. Adjusting this single parameter alters the data drastically. Over 7,000 grid cells flip into entirely different institutional categories. A true historical difference in how a state was governed cannot be created or destroyed by a modern researcher tweaking a GIS setting.
When a state's categorical identity shifts based on a walking assumption, the category is measuring the measurement technology, not the polity. The final test is substantive stability. If these typologies are primitives, the actual causal narrative they generate must survive alternative coding choices. This chart shows an estimated legacy from the primary temporal snapshot. It illustrates a positive legacy. Pre-colonial exposure increases modern conflict. But rerunning the model using an alternative 1880 snapshot plunges the data point below the zero axis. The sign reverses. Under one defensible specification, the historical institution causes more conflict. Under another, the exact same institution causes less conflict. A causal legacy requires genuine institutional persistence over time. An explanatory variable cannot represent a stable historical inheritance if the causal effect flips depending on which decade the coder decides to freeze in time. The instability is not noise. It is the visible trace of a reality that is not categorical in the first place. In the Rwandan Yigininya kingdom, royal authority was centralized over the military, but decentralized regarding land. These overlapping hierarchies defy a single classification score. The Asante Confederacy paired a central bureaucracy with highly autonomous constituent divisions. The balance of power between the center and the provinces fluctuated by decade. The Ethiopian Highland State breaks the spatial projection rule entirely. High elevations suppressed tsetse flies, allowing the imperial administration to project power using professional mounted couriers. Imposing a pedestrian walking model here renders the actual communication network structurally invisible. Precolonial authority across these regions was characteristically layered, negotiated, and overlapping. It was rarely organized into mutually exclusive territories. When a rigid, discrete four-cell typology is forced onto a reality of continuous, multidimensional networks, the act of categorical assignment necessarily discards historical information. The statistical instability detected by the framework tests represents the discarded truths of layered historical authority trying to resurface. A complex system operates under a specific set of rules. When you alter an underlying condition, the mechanism shifts its configuration and the outputs reverse. Economics confronted a structurally identical problem in the 1970s with the Lucas critique, which revolutionized how models evaluate policy interventions. Robert Lucas observed that macroeconomic relationships, like the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, are not structural features of the economy. They are regularities that emerge from people optimizing their behavior under a specific policy regime. Change the regime, human behavior adapts, and the supposedly stable relationship collapses. We can map the Lucas critique directly onto historical political economy. Statistical regularities that are entirely contingent on an arbitrary measurement architecture cannot be treated as structural bedrock. Failing to distinguish between a measurement contingent category and a genuine explanatory primitive guarantees that we will run regressions, output significant coefficients, and confidently attribute modern conflict and poverty to historical ghosts. If the underlying historical reality was dimensional and fluid, our statistical models must carry dimensions rather than discrete cells. We must replace rigid categorical labels and plot states directly on continuous axes, measuring the breadth of their elites and the directness of their administration, while actively propagating the uncertainty into the estimates. We must sacrifice the comforting legibility of clean categories to gain honesty about historical overlap and measurement uncertainty. Weberian ideal types remain powerful comparative tools for organizing thought and establishing a shared vocabulary. We must preserve them strictly as conceptual tools, but we must stop taking the fluid, layered networks of human history and asking them to act as the rigid bedrock of the world.